So I know you guys just sat down. If you could stand up one more time. I'm going to read to you two verses from Romans chapter 1. We are studying the letter of Paul to the Romans. And so we continue that today, and we're going to look at two verses, verses 16 and 17. Paul says this, "For I am not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile," and that's most of us. "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." God, these verses are so packed with powerful truths that can change and transform our lives. And so help us, God. Even if we've studied these verses for decades, God, let your word break through into our lives in a more significant, powerful way. Just help us to be attentive this morning to what your Spirit wants to teach us in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. "For I am not ashamed." I don't know if you've ever been ashamed or embarrassed. Maybe you were in a situation where you did something. Have you ever been walking along the street and you suddenly trip and you look back? Because you know people saw you trip, and you look back just to kind of give a look at whatever that crack was that tripped you. I remember maybe you walked into a super clean sliding glass door. You thought it was open, and it's embarrassing. Maybe my most memorable embarrassing moment, and I think I told you guys this a few years ago, but I was 16 years old with a good friend of mine, a few years older than me, and we stopped at McDonald's, and we walked into this McDonald's, and I look over to the left, and there's these three really cute girls about my age. What I didn't see was over here, be careful, wet floor. And I kind of, you walk a little different when you see some girls, right, guys? You just walk a little different. And I stepped on that floor, and whoosh, I was laid out flat, boom, right on my back. And I was a pretty shy, insecure kid, and so I got up and ran out of McDonald's. I couldn't handle the humiliation, the shame of what I did. I want to talk to you this morning about a few key words in these two verses. And the first one is the word gospel. Some translations, newer, more modern, readable translations use the word good news, but the word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion. This was a common Greek word before Christianity existed. It had to do with good news. And it was generally given by a herald. Hark the herald, angels sing. And so it was news that was delivered by a herald. This was the news media of the day. They didn't have internet, they didn't have social media to wherever you get your news from. And so they were heralds that were sent out throughout the Roman Empire to deliver news, primarily news that related to military victory. Hey, we conquered the Swedes, whatever they fought back then. And then about maybe the birth or the rise of a new king or a new ruler would fall under that umbrella of good news. And so here's my point. The essence of the Christian message is that it is good news. It is something that has already happened. It's not information, it's not advice, it is news that has already happened, and hearing this news, trusting this news is life transforming. Some of you, and this is my prayer as we work through the book of Romans, is that some of you would encounter Christ in new and significant ways. Some of you are in situations even today where you need a breakthrough. You're stuck. You have a hard time believing. Your faith seems to have stopped growing maybe. And what you need is a breakthrough. And what I could say is that these two verses have been more transformational in people's lives than any other passages of Scripture. The great Martin Luther, it was these two verses that launched the Protestant Reformation some 400 years ago. And it changed his life, and it has changed millions of people's lives over the last couple thousand years. Understanding what the gospel is and the power of the gospel in your life is is beyond what I can describe. It is transformational. And it's good news to everyone, not select few. Not if you're the right intellect or the right amount of money or the right skin color or whatever it is. It is for everyone, young and old, to anyone who believes. And this is important because the gospel is for anyone who believes, not anyone who behaves. And that's good news for all of us. But why would Paul or anyone be embarrassed or ashamed of the good news? It's because the good news, though it's good news, is sometimes hard to hear. And it was hard to hear in ancient Rome as well, for three reasons primarily. Number one, the Christians were going around proclaiming that there was one way to God. There weren't multiple gods, there weren't multiple paths. You know, you choose your own religion, they all end up in the same place. No, they went around sacrificing their lives and their money and all that they had to give the good news that there was one way. Now, Rome was a culture that was very tolerant of all religions. Sounds like modern America. And I'm not against tolerance, don't get me wrong, but Romans actually called Christians atheists because they only believed in one God. And yet that is what they lived for and what they died preaching. Secondly, Roman culture was absolutely incredibly hedonistic. The sexual depravity in ancient Rome was rampant, not unlike today's culture. And Paul is going to actually address that specific issue later on in Romans chapter 1. But the third reason that the Romans had a hard time with the good news, with the gospel, is because they idolized power. They idolized strength. Christians, on the other hand, worshiped a man who died on a cross. And so the cross was considered foolishness to many, and it was considered weak. In fact, crucifixion was only reserved for those who were non-citizens or specifically egregious felons. Paul himself wasn't even crucified. He was beheaded because that's what you would do to a Roman citizen. That was a more honorable way to kill someone. Here's some Roman graffiti that was uncovered by archaeologists many years ago, and you'll see that it is a picture of something on a cross. Well, here's what it is. It's a donkey. And there's an inscription. It's hard to read, but it says this. Alexamenos is the name. Alexamenos worships his God. And so this is a way to mock this Christian man who worshiped a God who died on a cross. Celsus was a very well-known historian, early centuries. He criticized Christianity often. He spoke out against it. He wrote against it. He said this about Christians. He criticized them for allegedly appealing to the uneducated, to the poor, to the women and children. Which, by the way, the Christian church was the only religion in the first century that cared at all for women, for the poor, for the uneducated, for children, and that's why they flocked to the early church. He viewed this as evidence that Christianity lacked intellectual rigor and catered to the gullible and the ignorant. And he said this specifically, "Let no one educated, let no one wise, let no one sensible draw near," that is, to Christianity. "For these abilities are thought by us to be evils, but as for anyone ignorant, anyone stupid, anyone uneducated, anyone who is a child, let him come boldly." Saw a short video the other day. It was Bill Maher. He does this after-hour thing. He talks to people for hours. He sits there and drinks and gets stoned. And he was talking to this guy named Russell Brand, who's a British guy. And he has recently converted to Christianity. Very dramatic testimony. Got baptized, the whole shebang. I mean, he went all in. And now he is using his social platform to talk about the gospel, to talk about how it has changed his life and can change other people's lives. And I found it interesting because Bill Maher, he's a well-known atheist, very intellectual, incredibly smart guy, and he often argues against Christianity, calls Christians stupid, idiots. He thinks the whole idea of God dying on a cross, rising from the dead, is absolute foolishness. Nothing's changed in 2,000 years. But I found it ironic and interesting, and he found it ironic, and I respect him for this, but he did admit that to believe in the Big Bang, that all this universe, and we find out more and more how big and vast it is, all came from something the size of a quarter. And he says, I've got to admit, it takes a lot of faith to believe in that, and that there is no God. And so the gospel is not good advice. All of the religions, all of their philosophies are all about good advice. In fact, if you asked your average person here in Santa Cruz County, what is the essence of Christianity? What is Christianity all about? Even if they don't believe, and most don't, what kind of response might you get? Maybe you would get something, well, be a good person. Try to, be tolerant of others. Be a loving person. Jesus was a loving person. Live by the golden rule. And I'm not completely against that. I wouldn't mind living in a world that honored and tried to live up to that standard. But here's the point. That's not news. And it's certainly not good news. In fact, I would argue that it's bad news. Why? Because how do you know? How do you know you're living good enough? On the scales of good and bad, how do I know when I've done enough good to tip the scales in my favor? So good news, not good advice. Very different. There is lots of good advice in the Bible. I mean, you don't have to be a believer to gain good wisdom and advice from the Bible. In fact, one of my favorite proverbs is Proverbs 27:14. If you live with someone who's a morning person, quote this verse. If anyone loudly blesses their neighbor early in the morning, it will be taken as a curse. I like that verse. Translation, don't be that overly chipper morning person. Nobody appreciates it before coffee, right? That's good advice. Now, a doctor who comes to you and you have a terminal illness, but he tells you, I have a prescription, all you got to do is be faithful, take this prescription, you will be guaranteed to overcome this disease, you will live. That is good news. And so the gospel is good news, not good advice, good news. It is something that has already happened, it's historical, it's something that we need only to receive. But the gospel also says here that it is the power of God. The power of God. See, if we come to the gospel as just good advice, we rob the gospel of its power to change and transform our lives. God bless you. And we sometimes rob the gospel of its power because the gospel is so countercultural. It was countercultural 2,000 years ago, and it is countercultural today. So we might be a little embarrassed at times. We might be a little shamed at times of the things that are taught in the Bible. And so maybe we water it down a little bit. Maybe we try to make it a little more palatable for people today. But when we do that, we've got to be very careful that we don't do that. It robs it of its power. There was a story I read this last week about a guy named Dr. Robert Courtney. He was a Kansas City pharmacist, and he pleaded guilty back in 2002 for diluting chemotherapy drugs for cancer patients. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but that was not until after 98,000 prescriptions had been affected for over 4,000 patients. 17 ended up dying, and yet he made $19 million in the process. But you got to wonder, before we're too hard on him, we need to look in the mirror at ourselves. Imagine how he justified this in his own mind. He probably didn't wake up one day and says, I'm going to try to kill people and get rich at it. At some point, he had to convince himself that what he was doing was helpful, maybe even good for the patients. And so we sometimes settle for a gospel that is watered down, easier to swallow. A gospel, for example, that makes us feel good. And we all want to feel good. I mean, let's be honest. We all want to feel good. But if the gospel doesn't at some point push back, if it doesn't challenge us, then maybe we haven't really understood the gospel. And so there is a gospel that we want that feels good. There is a gospel also that is simply inspiring platitudes, bumper sticker theology. For example, when one door closes, another opens. Every cloud has a silver lining. Happiness is not having what you want, but wanting what you have. Let go and let God. Everything happens for a reason. God never gives you more than you can handle. These are platitudes. They're nice. There's something you might put on a church sign, right? They might be inspiring, but there's no power in them. There's no power to change and transform the human heart. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeling good. There's nothing wrong with inspiration. But there's no real power there. And so we cannot seek or desire a gospel to make us feel good or desire the simply bumper sticker platitudes, but we also cannot buy into the gospel of self-help. In fact, that is the exact opposite of the gospel. The gospel, and when we understand the gospel, it challenges us that we cannot help ourselves. See, what makes the gospel powerful is not because it is like our current culture, is because it is different than our culture. And Christians and churches and pastors for too long in the Western world been trying to help fit into the market of the day. A couple times a year I like to go to Mexico because the dentistry is so much cheaper there. And so when I was there last with my wife, I forget the name of the town, it's right over the border from Arizona, and we're walking along to go to the dentist, and we pass shop after shop after shop after shop after shop, and we noticed they all had the same stuff. They all had the same blankets, they all had the same little trinkets, they all had the same things, and you might kind of wonder, why doesn't somebody do something different? But they all had the same thing. And why is it that they all had the same thing? Because that is what people were buying. That is what people were buying. There are 1,000 different ways in our current culture that we basically do the same thing. And that's why one of the greatest values in our culture is, for example, to each his own. You be you. What's true for you might not be true for me. Live your truth. And this is fine if we're talking about ice cream. But not when we're talking about the gospel. The gospel is not always popular. But it's always different than what our culture is trying to sell us. And our culture is trying to sell us things like instant gratification, microwave culture. Imagine, go back 40 years, 50 years, you that are old enough. Imagine Amazon same-day delivery. Imagine Uber Eats. I don't even have to cook. I don't even have to get out of my couch. I can just Uber Eats. Or how about this? Our culture is constantly trying to sell us tribalism. Hate those who have different opinions. Hate those who have different political differences. Or maybe the most significant in our culture, truth is subjective. Reality is what you make it. See, if we do what everyone else does, we become irrelevant. D.A. Carson, famous theologian, calls it domesticating the gospel. And he says that we domesticate the gospel when we won't talk about Jesus. When we talk about salvation, but we won't talk about sin. When we leave out the uncomfortable parts because we want people to like us, or because we don't want to offend someone, or we make the gospel just a moral code. Live a good life and you'll be fine. We make the gospel a list of do's and don'ts. I was listening to this podcast about a guy who's developed a prayer app. I think it's the #1 prayer app right now, called Hallow. And I've been using it recently just with my morning meditation. It's very Catholic influenced. I'm not anti-Catholic, but I don't pray the rosary. I don't pray to Mary. I pray to Jesus. But there's this movement in Hollywood right now where there's a lot of Christians beginning to speak out. And he has a relationship with Mark Wahlberg because Mark Wahlberg heavily invested into this app. And he said that in Hollywood, he's constantly being told by powers to be, tone it down, tone it down. It's okay if you talk about God, don't talk about Jesus. Have you noticed how Jesus is so controversial? And so to say, not ashamed, for Paul to even make that statement means that the gospel is offensive in some ways. It's offensive to everyone in some way. And it can be hard to receive the gospel because the gospel is first an indictment on me. It's an indictment on us. The gospel tells me I'm not enough. The gospel tells me I'm unable to save myself. The gospel tells me I'm a sinner and that I fall short of the glory of God. And if you've never felt the offense of the gospel, there's a good chance you haven't really understood it yet. See, the gospel tells me that I'm bad, that I'm helpless, and that I'm hopeless without Jesus. Another podcast I like to listen to is about survivors. It's these incredible stories of people who survive incredible circumstances. And back in the 80s, there was a young gal in her 20s named Michelle Hamilton, and she was on a canoe that drifted out to sea, unbeknownst to her, until it was too late, off the coast of an island in the Philippines. It was eventually capsized in a storm, but she clung to it, the overturned canoe, for 2 more days with no water, no food, and sharks in the area. Can you imagine 3 days, lightning storm, nothing but a bikini and flip-flops? At one point, she screamed at God. She couldn't believe that this was happening to her. She was asking God why. She was declaring to God, I'm a good person. I don't deserve this. And then something amazing happened. She began to realize that she wasn't as good a person as she thought. These memories started to flood her mind. The time that she stole this car with her boyfriend, the time that she lied, the time that she stole other things. It began to flood into her mind, and she cried out to God for forgiveness. And in that moment, in the darkness, in the sea, in the storm, lost at sea, she felt the presence and the love of God. She eventually was rescued by a Filipino fisherman who thought she was a mermaid. And she wrote this book, and now she travels around the world telling her story. So the gospel reminds us that we're wrong, that we're bad, that we don't have it all figured out. But it also reminds us that we're loved, that we're desired, that we have meaning and purpose in this life. And so the gospel does 2 things. Paul says here in verse 17, the gospel is the righteousness of God. And so the first thing that the gospel does is that it forgives us. It takes away our sin. All of our sin, past, present, and future, is forgiven. Amen. We are declared righteous with God, that is right with God. And so it takes away our sin, and then not only that, and that news is amazing enough that God would forgive all of my sin. But that's only part of the story. Because not only does he take away our sin, he gives us his righteousness by faith. And so the gospel says that we have been made righteous. That is, that we have been made right with God. See, the gospel answers the most fundamental human question that has been asked throughout human history. What's wrong with me? How do I get to God? Let me give you an example of these 2 truths at work. Take, for example, a guy who is in prison and the governor decides to show mercy. The governor pardons him, and so he's released from prison. He's served his sentence. He's forgiven. He's out there and he's just a knucklehead like the rest of us. But then, not only is he pardoned from all of his crimes, he is then awarded the Medal of Honor. And you and I, in a very real sense, who have trusted in Christ, have been given the cosmic Medal of Honor by God. Let me give you a verse that really hits home on these two realities. 2 Corinthians 5:21. For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the sin offering for our sin. There's your forgiveness. There's forgiveness. He is the offering that forgives your sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. There's the righteousness of God. And here's what you need to know. Everybody is struggling with being righteous. Even atheists, even agnostics. Everybody is struggling with this. Here's what theologians call functional righteousness. Fill in the blank. When I have, fill in the blank, I'll feel good about my life. Whatever you fill in the blank is your functional righteousness. And human history tells us that all humans have been pursuing this and looking for this functional righteousness. How do I feel right with myself? How do I feel right in this world? And people do it through financial status, they do it through achievements, they do it through reputation, they do it through having the approval of certain people. Whatever it is, fill in the blank. That is your functional righteousness. When I get, when I have, then I'll feel good about my life. I read a story this week about an elderly woman who was a staunch practicing Catholic. And she was very upset back in the 60s when they changed Vatican II. They changed the Latin services into English services. And this is why she hated it so much. She says, I liked it better when I didn't understand what they were saying. She liked to go in and kind of create her own idea of what God is like. She liked to go in and kind of create her own little religion, light a candle, say a prayer, meditate on something, because it was all about her. Feeling good about herself. See, we use religion sometimes too to become our functional righteousness. Righteousness has to do with being right with God. But here's what you need to know about righteousness. It cannot come from within. It's not something you can produce on your own. It must come from an outside source, something greater than us, something outside of ourselves. But for the sake of argument, because I've had these arguments with myself, especially when I was a young believer, well, why is the standard so high? God is God. Why can't He just forgive everyone? Why does He have to have such a high standard? What's the standard? Be perfect. Why can't it be just be really good? You don't have to be perfect, just be really good. That's the standard to be a good American. You don't have to be perfect, just be really good. But the question is then, well, how good? Where's the line? If I draw the line here, what if somebody else draws the line here? Where is the cutoff? What if you die and you don't have enough time to be good enough? What if you are born in a really crappy family and you learned really crappy things about life and you became a punk or a gang member, just whatever, you did stupid things. You were abused or something. You just didn't grow up in a very healthy home. What if the standard wasn't moral? What if the standard was you have to be smart enough? You have to have the right IQ. You have to have the right education. Then you will be saved. Or what if it's money? What if you have to be wealthy enough or rich enough? See, the gospel tells us, it reminds us that it is the most just and the most fair standard for all people for all time. And what is the standard? Be perfect. Which means we're all in the same predicament. We're all in the same crap. Sorry. I know I shouldn't say that. We all fall short. And on the other side of the coin, that means anyone, even me, anyone, even if they're not very smart, even if they're poor, even if they're morally messed up because of their upbringing, even if they've dug themselves a hole morally and it seems impossible to get out, anyone can be made right with God. Anyone can be saved. That's good news. That is good news. And so it is the power of God for salvation. What does it mean, salvation? What does it mean to be saved? And there's two aspects to salvation. There is the future promise that we will be saved, delivered from this life and all of its sin, all of its headache and heartache and disease and all that. But it is also a present reality. We are saved for heaven in the future, but we are also being saved in the process of being saved now. But saved from what? Ultimately, from the judgment of God. And that's part of the story we don't like to talk about today. Yes, God has a standard and God is a judge. He's not just a Santa Claus up in the sky. And so we cannot save ourselves. It's not about moral reform. It's not about how good we can be. But when you understand the righteousness of God, when these verses become alive and powerful in you, it actually begins to change and transform you into a better person. But it's news. It's news that can only be received by faith. And this is important because faith is one of those complicated, churchy, Christian words that is often misunderstood. It is not the amount of faith that you have that saves you. It is the object of your faith. So Jesus comes along and says, all you need to have is faith of a mustard seed, the smallest known seed in the first century. All you need is the faith of a mustard seed. Just a tiny little bit of faith. But the object of your faith is what Christ has done for you. He, God, is the object of your faith. When your faith is in Him and not in yourself, that is when you're beginning to understand what it means to be a Christian. Back in the 1600s, I think, there was a famous missionary. They called him the King of the Cannibals. His name was John G. Paton, and he was working with cannibalistic tribes in the South Pacific Islands, working on translating the Gospel of John. And so he'd spent a lot of time with these cannibals, and he fortunately didn't get eaten, but he had to learn their language, make it a written language, and then translate the New Testament into their language. And he spent many years doing that. But he kind of got stuck because he couldn't find a word in the local language to express the concept of faith or believing in. And so the islanders, they had no direct equivalent for trusting or believing in the way that it is understood in the Christian context. And one day while he was in his hut, a local came in, tired from a long journey. One of the versions I heard that they had caught a deer and had dragged the deer back into the little village there. And the man sat down in his chair and he stretched out, reclining his whole weight upon the chair. In seeing this, John Paton realized that he had found the perfect illustration. And he asked the man what the word he would use to describe the act of placing his full weight on the chair. And the man gave him this native word, which essentially is translated to lean your whole weight upon something. To lean your whole weight upon something. And so John 3:16, as he translated it, was translated this way: For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever leans their whole weight upon him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so what would it look like to completely lean your whole weight upon Jesus? Every aspect of your life. Probably 38, 39 years ago, I came across a letter written by a Zimbabwean pastor. And he was suffering for the gospel. And I want to read to you what he wrote. It's called The Fellowship of the Unashamed. He says this: I am part of the fellowship of the unashamed. I have Holy Spirit's power. The die has been cast. I have stepped over the line. The decision has been made. I am a disciple of his. I won't look back, let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense. My future is secure. I am finished and done with low living, sight walking, small planning, smooth knees, colorless dreams, tame visions, mundane talking, stingy giving, and dwarfed goals. I am no longer in need of preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, plaudits, or popularity. I don't have to be right, first, tops, recognized, praised, regarded, or even rewarded. I now live by faith. I lean on his presence, walk by patience, am uplifted by prayer, and labor with power. My face is set, my gait is fast, my goal is heaven, my road is narrow, my way is rough, my companions few. My guide is reliable, my mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of adversity, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, let up until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, and preached up for the cause of Christ. I am a disciple of Jesus. I must go till he comes, give till I drop, preach till all know, and work till he stops me. And when he comes for his own, he will have no problem recognizing me. My banner will be clear. Amen. I am a disciple of Jesus. Now, if I'm honest, I love those words. But if I'm honest, I'm not always there. There's times I fall short, way short. There's times I hold back. There's times I back down. But when I think about the gospel, when I think about how my sins have been wiped clean, forgiven, when I think about how Jesus has transformed my heart slowly over time, when I think about how he's changed me, when I think about how the gospel has changed the lives of people I know and love, my boldness grows. I'm not ashamed. And so, as I close this morning, I want to invite you. I want to do a little experiment here. But I'm going to read off several statements. And if a statement applies to you, I want you unashamed to stand up right where you're at. Now, if I read another line that also applies to you, you can raise a hand, or third hand, or leg. Some of you might have to jump. But stand if any of these apply to you this morning. Jesus has saved you from addiction. You've experienced the power of the gospel, and he's saved you from addiction. Amen. Look at that. If the power of the gospel has held your hand, Jesus has held your hand through unbelievably difficult circumstances, stand up. If Jesus has healed or even saved your marriage, stand up. If Jesus has saved someone that you love, you've been praying for them, and at some point it finally broke through, they finally received the gospel, and your prayers went fulfilled, stand up. If Jesus has saved you from depression or anxiety, it doesn't mean you don't still struggle some, but you've been delivered. You've seen the power of the gospel at work in your life, and your depression and anxiety is not near what it used to be. Stand up. Stand up if you've been saved from a life without purpose, a life without meaning. Stand up if you've been delivered from bitterness or unforgiveness. And there's no reason for you to forgive. They didn't even ask for forgiveness, but you were able, by the power of the gospel in your life, to forgive. Stand up if you've been saved from guilt and shame. God, thank you for the power of the gospel. I personally, God, could not imagine where my life would be without your intervention. And God, I know everyone here who is standing. They've encountered you. They've experienced breakthrough. But God, we are still hoping and praying for more breakthroughs. And God, if there's someone that has not fully understood the gospel, God, maybe this morning, maybe they would just say a simple prayer. God, I don't have much faith, but I want to trust you. Help me to trust you. God, I'm not sure if I believe in you, but help me in my unbelief. Believe in you. God, at that moment that we put our trust in you, the power of the gospel comes into us and changes and transforms our lives over time. And so, God, as we are about to partake in the Lord's Supper, it was not weakness, though it was viewed as weakness by the world. It was not failure, though it was viewed as failure by the Jews. You humbled yourself. And you went to the cross. And you rose again from the dead so that we who believe could encounter that same power in our lives. That power that rose Christ from the dead lives in us. And so I pray, God, that that power would unleash itself in us and that we would experience the love and the change and the transformation that you long for us. And we will become the people that you desire and that we desire as well. And so as we take that cup and juice and that little wafer that represents your body and blood, we thank you. And we accept you and we receive you into our lives to do your good work. God, let us not be ashamed of the gospel. In Jesus' name.